So, welcome everybody to our first work in progress meeting of the season from the Women in Parentheses project. My name is Anna Dyer and I'll be your host with Ellie Robson today. If you want to be abreast of all of our activities, please do join our Mapping the Quartet network and follow us on social media. All of that information can be found on our website, womeninparentheses.co.uk. For today's session, we're delighted to welcome Nat Dyer, who is going to present his talk, Mary Midgley Amongst the Economists. Nat is an independent researcher and writer based in the southwest of England. He's a fellow of the Schumacher Institute and previously worked as a researcher and campaigner for NGOs such as Global Witness and Promoting Economic Pluralism. Nat has written on Mary Midgley's life and ideas for magazines such as Philosophy Now and Resurgence and Ecologists. And as we were mentioning before, although Midgley didn't write much on economics, Nat found her critique of reductionism fruitful in analysing the economic stories and myths that shape society. Nat's first book is Ricardo's Dream, How Economists Forgot the Real World and Led Us Astray. There it is. It was published just last year, and in it he develops a historical and philosophical critique of mainstream economics. You can find a lot more about Nat on his lovely website, natdyer.com. So Nat will talk for about 45 minutes. We will then have a 3-minute breather, and then we will move on to questions. And so we will finish at about 4:30 p.m. BST, so that's an hour and a half from now. Now, some house rules, if I may. If it is possible for you to keep your video on throughout the talk, please do so, because it's otherwise a bit disconcerting to just see blank boxes. Obviously, a lot of the time people just can't do it for whatever reason. In that case, that's fine. It's just if you can, please do. And of course, keep your microphone off unless you're asking a question. We would also ask you to be judicious in your use of chat during the talk, just because it can be distracting from the talk. But during questions, we warmly encourage you to put questions on chat if you prefer to do so than to ask on video for whatever reason. Ellie will be keeping an eye on those questions, so we won't miss any. Finally, we are recording the talk and we will then make it available on our YouTube channel, but we won't be recording the Q&A session. So only Nat will be recorded. Right, so with all of this in hand, it is now my great pleasure to pass you on to Nat. Nat, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you for the rest of the Mapping the Quartet team. Love what you are doing and have done, and done it with so much creativity to talk about these four thinkers, and really pleased to be talking with you today about Mary Midgley, aware that there are many people who might know her work better than me on the call, and also that what I'm going to present today does very much fit the title, being a work in progress rather than a sort of finished thing. I'm going to share my slides now, so hopefully that will pop up. You should all now be seeing the slides. Thank you. So yes, I'm going to talk to you today about Mary Midgley Amongst the Economists. Please do, that's my email there and my Blue Sky link if anyone wants to get in touch and talk about any of these issues or ideas after the meeting. Do go ahead and do that. It'd be nice to hear from you. So yes, to give you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about, 4 main things. So I've got about 20 slides in total. The first is 20 slides and then 4 sections. So the first section is going to be looking at the role of economics in Midgley's work and life. The second part is going to be looking at my book, Ricardo's Dream. The third part is arguing about how Midgley can illuminate economics. And the fourth, I've called it Reflections Back on Midgley. It could be called Extensions, but thinking about concepts and ideas that I've come across through researching the history and critique and philosophy of economics that might help illuminate or reflect back on some of Midgley's thinking. So that is the idea. And yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A and your responses to this. And the general, my general argument, which was put in the abstract of sense around, was that Midgley's work contains a really powerful, broad critique, which can be used to understand and investigate mainstream free market economics, but that is quite latent in her work, and it's not drawn out. So it's quite a fruitful area for more research. So here we go. So in the first one, before I jump in, this is a slide which looks at some of the reports, some of the stuff I used to do. So just so you understand where I'm coming from. As Anna said, I used to work for NGOs like Global Witness or Rainforest Foundation, working on things like deforestation or forest carbon rights or corruption in oil and mining deals, often in Central Africa. And it was really from working on those sort of, I guess, hard, quite close to the ground issues, and that I was aware that there were conceptual problems, ideas that were helping to facilitate or cover up for some of these negative consequences, which obviously, Mary would talk about philosophical plumbing. And so so my work in some ways is trying to work back from these to look at some of the stories and myths that are harmful, whilst also hopefully not getting completely lost in abstract debates and keeping an eye on what's happening in the real world. So that's my process. And in terms of my specific engagement with Mary and with economics, I wrote a couple of profiles about Mary in 2000. I went to the Biscuit Tin Tour before it was interrupted by COVID in Oxford and wrote about that in Resurgence and Ecologist magazine. Also went to the Midgley Centenary in Conway Hall, which was a great event. And I wrote a profile of Mary for Philosophy Now as well. And then I can't remember the exact timing, but maybe it was a year after that or so, I got the proposal approved with my book, Ricardo's Dream. And I'm aware going through this just how much Mary's work has kind of influenced that work, which is what I'm going to be talking to you about. So you see a stack of Midgley books and books on Midgley there, just to show you some of the inspirations. And one that's missing from there is What is Philosophy For?, which I hadn't found at the time. And I wanted to highlight the third one up by Schwartz, because it's called At Home in the World, Human Nature, Ecological Thought and Education After Darwin by Elon Schwartz. And I'm mentioning it just because I've almost never seen it referenced, but I think it's actually a brilliant book that really nicely talks about Midgley's evolutionary thinking and makes the parallel between how Midgley used Darwin and how John Dewey used Darwin, obviously the pragmatist philosopher. And so I think I would recommend anyone to check out that book. My general thought is that economics played a role in Midgley's thinking and certainly her life, but it's often a role that's kept mostly in the background or latent, and she almost never does a full deep dive into economics. It played a role in her life because she came of age in the 1930s when there was much popular interest, or maybe not popular, but among certain sort of intellectual interest in Marxism, which she kept herself somewhat away from. And then she was also deeply marked by the turn towards a more Thatcherite or neoliberal or raw capitalist society in the 1980s, which she critiqued. And they were sort of poles around which she, I think, understood much of the dynamic evolving dynamic of the society that she was in. And she also saw economic stories and myths as being extremely powerful in the world, and also generating and influencing our feelings about nature and our feelings about evolution. And so often my observation is that Midgley does mention economics from time to time, but it's often in little asides. So, for example, in The Myths We Live By, which is one of my favorite books from her, she calls social Darwinism a cosmic projection of 19th century economics. And then later, when she wrote, she said similar things in many areas, but in The Independent in 2007, in an interview, she's quoted as saying, "The ideology Dawkins," it's Richard Dawkins of The Selfish Gene, obviously, "is selling us, is projecting a Thatcherite take on economics onto evolution." So in both historical times, she sees, economics almost being downstream of evolutionary thinking, and highly influencing it. But as I said, I'm not aware that she really digs into the history of economics or how that came about. And she's written elsewhere about this. One of the distracting fantasies of our time is the deep reliance on markets. But because it's Midgley and because she's quite, balanced in a way, also you can read in The Owl of Minerva her talking about Marxist dreams or Marxist fantasies. And I think it's fair to say that she saw the Thatcherite raw capitalism and the Marxism as kind of mirror images of each other in some ways, both overly simple stories or fantasies that gathered many adherents, but also led to many blind spots, and both, at least in their traditional form, neglecting the fact that we are animals and we are dependent on the natural world. So, in her mind, quite blind. Referencing that ecological point of view, which obviously was very, very strong in Mary's work, with thanks to Amy Taggart, who pointed this out on Blue Sky to me. In her pamphlet, Gaia, The Next Big Idea, Mary wrote, "Only gradually is it beginning to emerge that ecology is actually more important science than economics, that the profitable exchange of goods within the ship is a less urgent matter than how to keep the whole ship above water." So this links to, her very strong ecological thinking, and wanting, it's implicit in this quote that economics is primary at the moment, but that it shouldn't necessarily, that it shouldn't be, and that actually our dependence on nature and ecology is more important. But again, in that paper, she doesn't really say more about economics. Actually, the most sort of details that she has gone into economics, as far as I'm aware, is this piece I found, or maybe refound, whilst researching this talk in The Guardian from 2001, called "The Banker's Vision is Limited." It's in a series they're having about globalization, and it was written on the back of that Demos paper about Gaia. And she calls free market economics the banker's vision, which I thought was very interesting, and remarks that the abstractness and elegant simplicity of economics, at first it was seen as a virtue, but it has misled us terribly, and that this vision of the world, this banker's vision, is a dream from which the current environmental disasters are now awaking us. And I found it remarkable in that this dovetailed so nicely with some of the critique and even some of the same language, the use of dream, for example, that I have in my book, Ricardo's Dream. I don't think that is a coincidence. I think I was just deeply influenced in many ways by Midgley, and I've realized, flipping through the books, probably more than I had realized before. So moving on to Ricardo's Dream, and then I'll try and look at some of the parallels. So what it does, it's published at the end of last year by Bristol University Press, and it tries to trace the 200-year battle within economics about whether conceptual simplicity is a vice or a virtue, and it ultimately calls for a more holistic, historical, and human economics. The subtitle is "How Economists Forgot the Real World and Led Us Astray." And so you can see, just going back to the last slide, Midgley's talking about this banker's vision as a dream, and I talk about Ricardo's dream. Now, Ricardo, who you may or may not be aware, was a classical economist. I describe him as the other founding father of economics. Adam Smith is more famous and is often known as the founding father of economics. But actually, Smith was quite a broad-minded moral philosopher who, wrote the theory of moral sentiments. He was interested in psychology. He was deeply interested in history. He didn't construct the sort of simplified models that have dominated mainstream economics, at least at the end of the 20th century. But Ricardo did, and many people have traced those type of simplified models to Ricardo's reasoning. And an intriguing biographical, Midgley talks about how, thought often springs from the rest of our emotional life. And there have been people who have argued, and I argue it in the book, this is a quote on the right of the screen from Terry Peach, who's a Ricardo expert. And he says, Ricardo seems to have assumed that there was a stockbroker similar to himself in every man. Let me break that down a little bit. Ricardo was a master of the London Stock Exchange. He started working there at 14. He retired at just over 40, having made a mint on having money in British stock during the Battle of Waterloo and Britain winning the Battle of Waterloo. He had excellent knowledge. He was obviously made himself extremely rich. He could do these immense calculations seemingly quite easily. He stayed very cool. He didn't get emotionally invested in stuff. And actually, all of these are the same characteristics as the economic man, or homo economicus, which sits in the center of much modern economics. And so this quote from Terry Peach suggests that Ricardo looked out into the world and imagined that everyone basically he saw the inner stockbroker in everyone, minutely focused on prices, self-interested. And this is obviously the rationality of that sits at the heart of so much economics. And if you can't see me, I did air quotes of rationality because we will come back to that. And Midgley's thinking is very influential here because this is saying it was a huge imaginative leap to get to this point of seeing a stockbroker inside everyone. To break down a little bit some of the arguments I make in the book, essentially it's arguing about the huge gap or gulf between economic theory and economic reality, time and time again. And I start by taking the historical example. So if you look at the far left-hand side of the screen, this is something that might be taught to introductory economics students based on Ricardo's most famous example of comparative advantage. So that's the idea that countries, and everyone actually, when they trade, they should do what they're best at or what they're least worst at. And even the weakest and worst, least efficient country can still benefit by opening their markets and trading with others. And that trade is win-win, essentially. And this is often described by an example that Ricardo himself used. This is often introduced by an example that Ricardo himself used of two countries and two commodities. And those countries are England and Portugal and cloth and wine. And so when you're taught it, you're taught about how efficient each country is at producing each commodity. And in the imagined model, England is worse at producing both things. It takes them more people to produce them. But if you crunch some simple numbers, you get the counterintuitive result that it still makes sense for England to focus on cloth, which it is least worst at, and Portugal to focus on wine. And if they swap, they both win and global production increases. And so this has been called the most beautiful truth, the profoundest truth of economics, and underpinned a lot of the gung-ho pro-globalization feeling among economists in the 1990s and the 2000s. And the story that I write in the book, and I'm indebted here to Matthew Watson, who's a political economist at Warwick University, who first alerted me to this, is that actually there was a genuine treaty between England and Portugal in cloth and wine in the century before Ricardo wrote, called the Methuen Treaty of 1703. And after the treaty, trade did boom in both cloth and wine, but Portugal never exported enough wine to make up for the cloth that it was importing. So I'm talking about the middle picture now, which is from my book. And so for decade after decade after decade, it had a huge trade imbalance. And it made up that trade imbalance through gold. And that gold came from its colonies in Brazil. And that gold was dug primarily by enslaved Africans. And the enslaved people were brought over from Africa in the Middle Passage. And actually, a lot of the cloth that arrived in Portugal only transitioned through Portugal. And in some years, I think more than 70% continued on to West Africa to be exchanged for captives to mine gold and also sugarcane and other commodities needed in Europe. So, in fact, it all depends where you shine the spotlight. If you just shine the spotlight on England and Portugal, yes, you've got this lovely win-win deal. But actually, if you zoom out, you see that there are many other areas and peoples who did not benefit from this trade. It wasn't win-win. And also what it misses is the power dynamics. Portugal, actually, their cloth industry was handicapped in their industrial development through this deal, but they needed Britain for its naval power and might, because it was threatened by Spain and by France. So just by focusing on the narrow example, you ignore many other things disappear, like power, colonialism, empire. So that's one of the stories. And then I try and bring this forward and say similar things have happened in finance, in modern trade deals, in environmental economics, which we'll talk about, and in corporate power. You can see the same dynamics of these models, which are sophisticated, mathematical, but also deeply misleading. I think one of the reasons I was inspired by Midgley, she talks a lot about at various times how many different people in many different fields were inspired by Newton's simplistic laws in order to try and, have in psychology or somewhere else, have a similar sort of unifying law. And so I started the book with Newton, and then I was surprised to find actually that the real Isaac Newton was involved in this very gold trade. And that's what's seen on the right through a Guardian piece that came out when the book came out. In that Newton left Cambridge and got a job as Master of the Mint, where he was Master of the Mint for almost 30 years until he died at the end of his life. And he revolutionized the mint, and he got a fee for every new coin that was minted. And it was at this time there was a massive influx of Brazilian gold, partly because of the Methuen Treaty. And so Newton grew extremely rich due to this gold that was mined by enslaved peoples. And those connections hadn't really been made by Newton scholars. So I was pleased to do that, and it was fortuitous that it links to kind of Newton's role on an intellectual level too. I wanted to share, this is not just about people from the outside bashing economics. This has been a debate within economics itself, and I wanted to share a couple of quotes. And sorry, there's quite a lot of text in these slides, but I think you're quite a advanced academic audience, so putting more quotes than I normally would in. But yeah, so this is John Maynard Keynes, as most people will know, is a prominent 20th century economist, but then fell out of fashion in the 70s and 80s when the more free market, Milton Friedman-esque economics came in. And he criticized, the Ricardo type theorists. He said that they resemble Euclidean geometers in a non-Euclidean world. And I love this image of people who think that, the world should be geometry and are treating it as such and are approaching it with the tools of geometry, but the world refuses to conform to it because actually it's a non-Euclidean world. And it really made me think of the image on the top right, which is from William Blake. So there's a huge bust of it outside the British Library, or a version of it, and it shows an idealized Newton leaning forward, focused very narrowly on this small mathematical structure, whilst he is blind to the swirling forces around him. And I think that summarizes a lot of the problems that we've seen in economics in the last few decades. I also love this other quote from Keynes. He's writing to an economist in the 30s, and he's basically critiquing economists. Sometimes it's called physics envy. So it's economists who envy the methods of physics, who want to ape physics methods. And he said, look, this is just not going to work because people are not like apples. He's obviously talking about the famous idea of Newton's apple, Newton watching an apple fall to the ground. And he said, this only works if the fall of the apple to the ground depended on the apple's motives, on whether it's worthwhile falling to the ground, and whether the ground wanted the apple to fall, and on mistaken calculations on the part of the apple as to how far it was from the center of the earth. Obviously, this is quite a strange fantasy, but he's showing, by showing it in that direction, he's showing how bizarre it is that we treat humans as atoms or apples. And so I like that quote very much, and end book with it. So we've done a little bit of what Midgley does or doesn't write about economics. I told you a bit about Ricardo's dream, and I want to dig in more detail about how Midgley illuminates economics. And so maybe if everyone can mute, because I'm just getting some other noises in there, that would be great. So key to this for me was to see that economists, what Midgley helped me see and express, is that economists are not just number crunchers, but visionaries. And what they see or fail to see matters. Now, if you read publications such as The Economist sometimes, or elsewhere, the serious press, you'll get the idea that economists are these, just completely focused on the data. They're empirical, it's quantitative. And so, essentially they're just number crunchers and they're showing the truth. But actually, if you dig into some of the assumptions and where this comes from, you realize actually that many of the great figures in economics were visionaries. And as I say, what they see or fail to see matters. And this is very Midgleyan, but I think it does map onto economics. I think she highlights, her work enables us to see what a role imagination has played in economics. So, for example, in seeing the world as if it were populated by stockbrokers focused on prices, which is absolutely fundamental to a lot of the sort of classical standard models. And more generally, how powerful imaginative world pictures have contributed to the exploitation of people and planets. This is her famous philosophical plumbing. Getting a bit more specific, Midgley helped me to think about terminology and communication and the way in which expert groups communicate to a general public. And so I was inspired by, in her famous back and forth with Richard Dawkins. So she wrote an article, Dawkins replied, and then she wrote a follow-up article. And that follow-up article, called Selfish Genes and Social Darwinism, she argues effectively that, she had critiqued Dawkins' use of selfish. Dawkins came back and said, you have just misunderstood. When a biologist uses selfish, what they mean is X, Y, Z. We are not talking about selfish in an everyday term. And Midgley comes back and says, actually, then essentially you should have chosen a different word, or you should have been much more careful. So using words such as selfish as technical terms can confuse thinking, because especially when the term has a strong and emotive meaning in everyday speech. She says it's not enough, even if you remind your readers time and again of the narrow technical definition, that's not enough, because it has such a strong emotive meaning in everyday speech that bleeds over. This is not helped also when the writer moves between its technical meaning and its everyday sense, which she accused Dawkins of doing. And she also said that this is particularly a problem when the technical restricted sense falls outside the everyday meaning. So Dawkins was saying, well, when I use selfish, I don't mean selfish in the way that, economic selfishness, but Midgley saying essentially, well, then choose a different word. And this was instructive for me because there are many similar terms in economics. And so the ones that I just referenced at the bottom of the slide are the terms rational or efficient or free. So often we can think of, free markets, but free for whom? Rational and efficient. If someone were to ask you, do you think the economy should be rational and efficient, or should it be irrational and inefficient? You're going to choose rational and efficient, right? Because it sounds better. Who would want an irrational and inefficient economy? And rational is one of these words that has quite a strong emotive meaning, especially because irrational is synonyms of irrational might be mad or crazy. So, but actually, the way that it's employed in a technical sense is, I would argue, falls outside of its everyday meaning. Essentially, rational in an economic sense means calculating and self-interested. So any behavior that is not self-interested is deemed irrational, or basically a paradox to be explained in the standard economic approach. Likewise with efficiency in this sense, having an efficient economy, has nothing to do with using resources wisely or the maximum human happiness from the least use of resources. Nothing about that at all. There are many different ways that economists use efficient, but the primary one, I believe, is basically it means maximizing GDP. It means growth. It means, but the use of the term efficient, I think, blinds people to that. So again, I think the use and abuse of technical terms is something that I borrowed from Mary and has been helpful. And then the third one of the specific points in which Midgley helped to illuminate economics is, treating the earth as an externality is irrational, and has done a better job of protecting economic theory than protecting the living world. So what do I mean by this? I don't know how many people are aware of the sort of idea of externalities. Essentially, it's quite an important idea in economics. The core theory, stripped to its simplest terms, is that any deal, any economic trade, must be beneficial for each individual, because they would never enter into that trade if it was not beneficial. There are many reasons why that is not correct, but that is the core theory. But there might be a third party who hasn't entered into that deal who might be impacted. So maybe like a classic example from like the 1920s was someone buys a whole load of goods from a factory. The person buying the goods is happy, the factory's happy, but the factory produces a lot of black smoke that then means that the laundry business next door that hangs their laundry out can no longer have clean laundry, and their business is ruined. So that's a negative externality. And then the classic example of a negative externality is something like global warming or other environmental issues, in that the earth or the natural systems, the living planet, is not included in the deal, but they are harmed. Now, this is used and has been used since about the 1970s by mainstream economics as a way of trying to come up with an answer to the ecological crisis and the environmental movement. And it's often seen as a positive thing by NGOs and environmentalists, because they say, oh, okay, economics is paying attention to the living world. But my way of approaching this is, if you remember the economic man or the internal stockbroker, essentially he or she looks around and all he can see, and it was often a he, all they can see are prices. And the argument is that the natural world is being despoiled because it doesn't have a price on it. It's essentially invisible to these rational, calculating economic humans. Therefore, from this line of logic, the solution is to put a price on nature, and then finally we will value it. So that might be a price on a whale, a price on the benefit of walking through a wildflower meadow, the price on carbon emissions. And this is the mainstream answer to economics, to the environmental crisis. And it's been particularly promoted by an American economist at Yale called William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize for this work, which is not a real Nobel, but that's a different issue, in 2018. And but in his Nobel acceptance speech, he said, basically what he tries to do is balance the benefits of responding to climate change with the damage he thinks this will do to the economy, and to come to an optimum. And his optimum included allowing, global temperatures to go up to 3 or 4 degrees C higher than pre-industrial average by the end of the century, or maybe the beginning of next century, which is more than twice the targets agreed in Paris. And so essentially he's often argued for us not to do too much or go too far. But if you start digging into the numbers of where this what looks like a very quantified, scientific, mathematical approach, you actually realize it's based on wild assumptions and quite crude analysis, actually. And obviously it's blind to the much deeper idea that more radical ecological economists, such as someone like Herman Daly or E.F. Schumacher, or someone like Mary Midgley would make, is that we are completely dependent on the natural world. And so, I would argue that Mary helps, that this is an area of where we have a conceptual emergency, and Mary can help us get rid of this false solution. So there we go. So we're now on to the final part of my talk, and then I'm looking forward to your thoughts and responses. So reflections back on Midgley, or areas that I think, that can illuminate some of Midgley's thinking. So if you criticize models, as in the way that I have been, one response that often quickly comes back is a quote from George Box, who was a 20th century British statistician, and he wrote, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." And I think it's a pretty good quote, actually. And it's often used to say that it's invalid to critique a model for not matching up to reality, because actually that's what models do. They are like a map. And just in the way that the London Tube map is a simplified version, in that the lines are drawn straighter, they're more evenly spaced out than they are in reality, but actually it's more helpful because it's unrealistic. The analogy is that the model is more helpful because it allows you to see the essential things. Just as another example from a map, if I were to give you a map to my house, but as well as drawing the roads, I also drew every tree and every post box, that's going to be actively unhelpful. So a most helpful model or helpful map allows you to see what's essential and not see what's not. So it's a good point, but it's often used to dismiss all criticism of modeling, which I think is false. But the reason I raise it here is because when Box says all models are wrong, but some are useful, I see a connection with Midgley's thinking on myths. And I think, well, here's my suggestion to you, and I'm interested in your thoughts, that Midgley's thinking on myths could be boiled down to the phrase, all myths are wrong, but some are useful. And I think sometimes her thinking on myths can be quite difficult to understand in today's, and that's not her fault, but I think that, the very word myth essentially is often equated with just something that is useless and wrong. But Midgley is essentially saying, no, myths are essential. Myths are guiding stories, and some are more useful than others. So the myth of social Darwinism was harmful, but Midgley would argue the myth of Gaia theory is actually helpful because it orientates us. And so in some ways, all myths are wrong is an acknowledgement, which I'm pretty sure she acknowledges, is that no myth will completely map with reality. There will always be some sort of gap, but some are useful. And so, yes, it's my suggestion that perhaps with a little tweak to George Box's quote, that might help illuminate Mary's thinking on myths. Obviously not all of it, but a crucial part of it. A second point, and I was also alerted to this through George Box, is something called the Pygmalion syndrome, which I hadn't heard of before, but I think is very relevant to Mary's critique of reductionism. So you might know the Greek myth of Pygmalion. He was a ancient Cypriot sculptor who decided he disliked all, normal women, And so he went back to his studio. He was a brilliant sculptor, and he sculpted his own ideal woman. And effectively was so taken by his own art that he fell in love with this cold, mute statue, bought her gowns and necklaces and laid her in bed and all the rest. And Box uses this, and he says, the good scientist must not be like Pygmalion and fall in love with his model. And I really like this analogy because it says we should be. Essentially, what he's saying is that the scientist, the statistician, or the economist might create an economic model that is so beautiful, so well proportioned, so malleable, so easy to understand, so computable compared to the real world, that they will fall in love with this model and ignore the more messy reality. And I think Midgley is always directing our attention to the more messy reality. This, just out of interest, the Pygmalion syndrome, there's something different called the Pygmalion effect, which is a much more positive thing used in education and psychology. But this is the Pygmalion syndrome, more negative. And it was coined in the 1970s by this Irish mathematician and physicist called John Lytton Synge, but I might be pronouncing his name wrong. He says, I have invented the name Pygmalion syndrome for that disease of the mind, which blurs the distinction between the real world and model worlds. I love that he used the word disease of the mind. And he goes on to say, this is everywhere, and I suffer from it myself. So I think that's, I would suggest that that might help illuminate some of Mary's thinking too. And then the final thing, which is maybe a bit more speculative and probably where I need to do the most additional work and kind of thinking of it, but it's something I'm calling the if-is problem. And I do mention it briefly in the book, but only quite briefly. So obviously, I'm speaking to a crowd of philosophers. You will know better than me the Hume's is-ought problem, or is-ought distinction. And this is something that's regularly discussed in economics. Rather ironically, I think the neoliberal Friedmanite type of economics claim that they are just investigating is, and then therefore we can ignore ethics because that's ought, and it's a strange argument, but it is one that is still holds actually. But what I am interested in is ought, but I'm also interested in the blurred line between if and is, between investigating a hypothetical world and investigating the real world in which we live and breathe. So obviously this links to the Pygmalion syndrome as well. But if is and ought is about facts and values, if and is about assumptions and facts, and keeping those two separate. And what I would argue is that so often in so many different highly prestigious models, an if is made at the beginning, a big assumption is made, but then it is either conveniently or perhaps inadvertently forgotten that it was just an assumption, and the assumption gets turned into a dogma or a fact. And so the failure to observe this if-is distinction is endemic in mainstream economics. And I think it does link to the is-ought, because often in those assumptions there are buried values. So I think the assumptions often come with buried values. And so often what I basically found out is that the conclusion is contained in the assumptions. And there's a dogma in economics that you can pretty much have any assumption you want, which goes back to a Milton Friedman paper in 1953, where he actually argued the more wild the assumptions and the more unrealistic, the better the theory, which is something I'll let you think about. But essentially you can, there's a Stanford economist called Paul Flederer, who basically argues it's kind of reverse engineering. Any economist can come up with the answer that they want, and they can work back from that and work out what assumptions they wish, and they can get to it. And John Maynard Keynes talked about something similar. He said, when analyzing economics, don't focus on the polished layer right at the top of logic, which is very well done and works together. You need to dig under it and look at the assumptions. And I think, although I don't talk about this in the book, I think there is some parallel there between the embrace by analytical philosophy in the mid-20th century of method and logic, but a neglect of context to this mainstream economics. So there we go. I'm sure there are many more overlaps and extensions, but I have already talked for my allotted time. Here's my contact details again, if anyone wanted to get in touch with me. I think I will leave it there. I mean, I didn't say that, obviously, so much of Midgley's work is about isolation, atomism, scientism, reductionism, animals, ecology. So it may be argued, well, of course, she was against the whole mechanistic creed as she talked about it. Of course, she's going to be against economics. But I think there's a difference between saying that and actually kind of coming with the receipts, if you know what I mean, tracing carefully the parallels of where it works or not. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Nat.